Now, Executive Suites with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
When the owners of Cluck wanted to open a new farm supply store in Providence earlier this year, they ran into a common roadblock, the city zoning code. True, property regulations aren't exactly the sexiest issue, but they're one of the key building blocks for economic development, which is why Providence Mayor Angel Taveras just kicked off a year-long push to revamp the zoning ordinance.
We need to do everything we can to facilitate small businesses to have an orderly process, an efficient process, a process that is fair to everyone.
Should Providence's zoning code promote taller buildings or fewer parking lots? Who will decide, and how should they? This week on Executive Suite, we break down why you should care about the Providence zoning overhaul.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and later on in the show, we're going to be joined by Bonnie Nickerson from the city's Department of Planning and Scott Wolf, Executive Director of Grow Smart Rhode Island. But first, I'm glad to be joined by my friend Patrick Anderson, staff writer at Providence Business News. Patrick, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ted. Glad to be here.
And I want to show, this was front page news in Providence Business News, the zoning overhaul, and Patrick did a story there. And so I want to start by just asking you, why front page treatment for the zoning overhaul? Why is this a big deal?
Well, zoning is dense and complex, but it really does determine what residents can do with their property in some cases, what businesses can do, and it determines what neighborhoods look like in many ways. Whether there will be new McMansions in some neighborhoods, whether businesses, whether a Walmart or McDonald's or a new bar might be coming to your neighborhood. And then maybe more indirectly, it has an impact on the economy. When certain kinds of uses aren't allowed or there are restrictions on housing, that can drive the prices of different things up. It can certainly drive rents up, and the cost of housing is a big deal in Rhode Island and most places in the Northeast. So a lot of folks are looking at land use regulations as a way to stimulate the economy and potentially take advantage of some of the land, some of the assets that we have here in Rhode Island, the underutilized land that isn't being used as fully as it could.
Now, you dove in deep in that story we showed, and I just want to get a sense from you, what is this process? What is actually happening? Is it meetings? Is it all behind closed doors? How long will it take? What did you learn?
Well, it is going to be a long process, and it's the city this time around really wants to make it open. So they've already been meeting with the public, and they'll be having different meetings through the stages through the next year. It's not going to tackle downtown and the jewelry district because that was done last year in a zoning change. So it's really going to focus on the neighborhoods around downtown and try to improve the code for all of those more residential and neighborhood areas.
And I think we actually have the timeline we put up here. Let me see if my producer Nick can get that for us. Thank you. So here's the first phase, or the phase we're in right now. You see starting this fall and moving through next summer, they'll be drafting the new zoning overhaul and the ordinances. And then if we can look at the timeline following that, you'll get after the final draft, the implementation and teaching the staff about what's going to be happening. And that'll be about a year from now, so you have a 12-month process. Patrick, you talked to the city's planning director, Ruben Flores Marzan. What did he have to say about what he wants out of this and what the city, Angel Taveras and the others, are looking for?
He was really emphasizing some of the urban smart growth principles of making the city more walkable, more accessible for pedestrians and cyclists, and making it more possible that folks could live closer to where they work. He's interested in sustainability issues, and further down the line in issues about how the city is going to look if there are emergencies, another hurricane, something like Sandy. So those kinds of long-range sustainability issues are really on his mind, and the mayor has mentioned those as well.
And one that always comes up is parking minimums. Talk about arcane to people at home, but why are so many urbanist thinkers and people who worry about this stuff thinking about parking minimums?
Well, parking minimums are part of that, part of the matrix of things that favor automobiles against bicycles and pedestrians. And those two things often are pit in opposition to one another, with the folks who are more urbanist oriented wanting to reduce the amount of public space that's dedicated to automobiles. And by reducing parking minimums, they hope to create a denser environment where it's easier to walk around and less space is dedicated to parking cars.
Do you have any sense from your reporting on how Providence's parking minimums compare to in other parts of the country?
Well, it varies from different neighborhoods, but the rough number that I generally use is about 1.5 spaces per unit for residences. That's what's required, and that's generally a little more than most cities. I think most are generally around 1, but it's not hugely different, and it varies from place to place. But other cities, when they have tried to reduce parking minimums or even get rid of parking minimums, have faced a fair amount of resistance. Washington, D.C. was the latest, from folks who are really worried that this is a war on cars, and that there will be nowhere to park, and that eventually they'll be forcing people to take bikes and buses everywhere.
So we'll see how that plays out here in Providence. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll have two experts very close to this process talk about how the zoning overhaul in Providence could affect the city economy for years to come. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi, and this week we are taking a deep dive into the Providence zoning overhaul, which is about as dull a pitch for a television program as you can make, but it's really important, and I have three people here who can help us understand why. Joining me on the panel, he was here in the first segment, is Patrick Anderson, staff writer for Providence Business News, and I'm pleased to welcome from the City Planning Department, Bonnie Nickerson. She's Director of Long Range Planning and knows her way around these issues very well, and Scott Wolf, he's the Executive Director of Grow Smart Rhode Island, which is an advocacy group that works for improving how we use land and other things in Providence and in Rhode Island. So first, I want to show a map before I bring you guys in and give people a sense of, we're not looking at all of Providence having skyscrapers by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe there'll be no skyscrapers, but we have certain parts of the city where we think there could be growth, and that's those dark blue areas on the map, not the bay and the river, but the dark blue areas in sort of the center of the city. And that might give people a sense of what we're really talking about changes perhaps in the future. So Bonnie, let me ask you, starting off, why is this a big deal? We heard some from Patrick, and what do you hope it can accomplish?
Sure. Well, this is a great opportunity for the city. As you know, the mayor put out his economic development plan last spring, and this was one of his top agenda items, was to really get our zoning code up into the 21st century and help move the city forward. And going back to that map, I think that's a great map that shows we've done a robust planning process with the community, and that was from our comprehensive plan. And during that process, we asked people, where do you think we should look for growth and change to happen in the city? And what are those areas where we really want to preserve what we have as it is? And so those lighter areas on the map are the residential areas that we want to protect and grow and enhance as they are. And you saw the blue areas and the red-lined areas are the former industrial areas, downtown, and the commercial districts, the commercial corridors. And those are the areas where we think we can accommodate additional growth that's planned really smartly and aligned with our goals and policies that we've set forward through the comprehensive plan and other planning documents in the last 5 or 6 years.
Scott, same question to you. You're looking at a bit from the advocacy side, but you know these issues well. I mean, what do you think and hope Providence can accomplish with this process?
I hope that this can help Providence continue the momentum that I perceive it has in attracting young, talented people from around the country and in retaining a lot of young, talented people who are growing up here. And I think you can't underestimate how much all American cities are in a competition with one another to get these young, creative, smart folks. And the more pedestrian-friendly and transit-friendly and efficient our city is, the more we are going to be in an advantageous position to attract these kinds of people.
Bonnie, I want to bring in Patrick in a second, but Stephen Miller, Rhode Island native, he writes for Streets blog in New York, loves transit stuff, and he asked a good question. He was curious what you'd say. When you look at other cities that have done these kind of rewrites, is there anywhere that you think did a particularly good job, or lessons Providence has learned from Cincinnati did it, Washington did it? When you look around the country, what do you see?
Well, I think it's really important to note that every code is unique to the place where it is. So we can't look at any particular city and say we're going to do it just like they did, because the conditions on the ground in Providence are unique to any other city. Our legal structure is unique to Rhode Island. Our neighborhoods are unique, and the types of goals and policies that we've set out are unique to Providence. So our ordinance is going to reflect that. One thing that we can learn from other cities across the country is a lot of cities have been doing this type of work, bringing their ordinance into the 21st century, and we can learn from them sort of modern techniques of how to integrate design and form-based controls, and how to have ordinances that are really clear and user-friendly and incorporate a lot of graphics and things like that, and sort of just modernizing our ordinance.
Because we should be clear to people, this hasn't been done in full since 1951. There's been changes, but it's not been a full process.
And I think that's a very important point, that the foundation of the ordinance that we have is really built on a suburban model, which was the fashion at the time in the 1950s. And so many cities are sort of backtracking from that now and figuring that the Band-Aids that they've done over time really need to be overhauled.
You take corner stores, for example. There's a proposal in this rewrite to have more flexibility for corner stores in residential neighborhoods. That's the old model. That's the model that was in place when Providence was growing and thriving in the early 1900s, and so it's sort of a back to the future kind of movement here.
Bonnie, on the parking issue, the parking minimums issue, how far is the city going to go on this? In terms of reforming the current parking minimums?
Sure. Parking is certainly a hot topic, and I think we've all heard a lot about parking. And there's a lot of good ideas of how to modernize our parking regulations. So you were right in saying that we currently require 1.5 spaces per every residential unit. And that just might not be necessary. And I think, again, that sort of goes back to that suburban model, that the city is trying to encourage a lot of modes of transportation. So we can maybe reduce some of those requirements. So we haven't decided on exactly how far we're going to go. We could go as far as saying that there isn't a parking requirement, and that site constraints and the market would actually dictate the number of spaces. The other idea is just to reduce the requirement, to sort of loosen up some of these requirements a little bit. And then certainly there's a conversation about parking maximums is another way to go. So I think the answer is this is an area we're going to really look closely at through our process this year, and we're going to put something into place that is more progressive than what we have today.
And Scott, where would you go? How far would you take it if you had your wish?
Well, I think it needs to be neighborhood specific. I don't think you can say citywide this is going to be the minimum, but I think in
transit perhaps.
Right, where there's a robust transit service, then I think we should be looking at reducing the parking minimum substantially, and maybe we trade it off with some additional space for bicycles. You take the arcade downtown. That's a partially residential redevelopment, and I don't believe they have any parking spaces, but they have a lot of accommodations for bicycles because they're expecting a very young bicycle-oriented group. Now, that's not everybody in the city, obviously, and we can't say that the car is going to go away. We've got to be pragmatic about it, but we also need to be encouraging, I think, the kind of sustainable pedestrian and transit-friendly development that we know is beneficial to the economy and is what more and more people want.
Bonnie, we're coming up on a break, but I do want to get one technical question people might have out of the way.
Sure.
They might say, well, didn't we have that big Providence Tomorrow plan and neighborhood charrettes and all these things?
Yeah.
Didn't we already do all this? So how do those fit together?
Yeah, sure. So that's a really good point. This is a year-long process, but it's really building on the 6 or 7 years that we've been doing this planning. So we rewrote our city's comprehensive plan and then went out to the neighborhoods and did a neighborhood charrette in every one of our 25 neighborhoods. And so we've developed a very solid policy on where we want to go as a city during that community engagement process. And so this is the next step, which is translating all of those policies into the regulation that's going to make them a reality. So we have, the ordinance has always lagged behind as a tool to implement these good policies that we have. And so this is really our opportunity to bring our ordinance, to be that progressive tool that we need.
And if the job is done well on rewriting the zoning ordinance, it will come close to putting the Providence Zoning Board out of business, and I'll be looking for a new part-time
Yeah,
job
'cause I was
because
gonna
I'm
say
on the
you're on there.
Providence Zoning Board.
Is that a good thing?
And is it a good thing that it will be put? Yes, yes, because what it would mean is the process would become more predictable. People would know up front what they could or couldn't do, and there'd be more accommodations for the kind of development that fits naturally into a neighborhood. Right now, a lot of development that fits naturally into some of our neighborhoods is not allowed. And so people have to get an ordinance to have the same size lot as most of the other lots that surround them. And I think this process would eliminate a lot of that wasted energy and kind of incongruous regulation.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, much more about Providence rewriting how the city develops and uses its limited amount of land. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi, and we're talking about the overhaul of the Providence zoning ordinance, a big job with big implications for the city. And I'm joined on the panel by staff writer for Providence Business News, Patrick Anderson, and from the City of Providence Planning Department, Bonnie Nickerson, and from Grow Smart Rhode Island, Scott Wolf. And Bonnie, we were talking before the break with Scott about putting the zoning board out of business. What do you think of that? Do you think that's a good thing?
I think that's a great idea. And what we want to do is reduce your workload by 2/3. And I think we can easily do that with this rewrite, because what a good zoning ordinance can do, it can set the stage for good economic growth, but it can also reflect the pattern of development that we have in place. And I think a lot of the cases that are going before the board are things that we want to allow by right. It's a pattern that developed and exists in neighborhoods, and people just want to make improvements to their property. And those are the small cases that are taking extra time and extra money, and those are things that should be allowed by right. So I think if we put in place a good ordinance that reflects the character of our community, we're going to reduce the workload of the zoning board by a lot.
And in addition to simplifying and making clearer the zoning ordinance and making it more in touch with the neighborhoods, is there any sense in the city that the zoning ordinance might encourage more development, or encourage, especially in residential, that this could be a tool to have more growth of apartments or housing to increase the supply?
I think in certain areas, and it's something that Scott said, where we have good transit service, we're looking at TOD development, which is transit-oriented development. And in those areas in the city, through the planning process, we've identified where those community hub locations are, where we want to allow for a little bit more density, so relaxing some height requirements and density requirements and reducing parking to allow for some larger scale buildings in those areas that are already served by transit.
I also think that there's a need for better landscaping incentives and encouragement in the zoning ordinance, and I think that's the direction that the city is heading in, and I'm pleased about that, because we can have a city that's both more densely developed in certain areas, but also greener. The two are not incompatible. In fact, the two can be linked.
Bonnie, I want to ask a basic question about how people can get involved with this process, where there's room for people. I know rezoningprovidence.com is the website. People can read. There's a great report from your consultant which lays out a lot of these issues. But what else is going to be happening where people can make their voices heard, get to know what's happening, what the process is?
Absolutely. So this is a year-long process that we just kicked off this month. So we had a public meeting earlier in September, and throughout the year, we're going to be doing a series of workshops on various topics that are all open to the public, and a series of public meetings. So anytime we have some drafts ready for review, we're going to be bringing those to the public. We also have a stakeholder group that's going to be guiding the process, and that's made up of members from the Providence Zoning Board, from different departments within the city, our legal team, and that group is going to be guiding the process. But I think it's really important that we note that this is a collective process. So this is something we're going to be building together as we go through the year. And you mentioned the website, there's an opportunity to submit comments, and all of those things are going to influence the way that we shape our ordinance.
Scott, I want to ask you about Cluck. We talked about it at the top. You're on the Zoning Board of Appeal. I mean, if this goes well, would we not see a fight like they had over Cluck, and that was between the church across the street and what they wanted to do there? Could this get rid of those kind of fights?
I think it can get rid of some of them. Whether it could have gotten rid of the Cluck fight, I'm not actually entirely sure, because I think that was as much of fight about different sort of cultures and different generations as it was about the specific zoning issue before us.
Well, the residential professional district might go away. In the consultant's report, they suggested taking a look at that and possibly getting rid of that or changing it. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I think Broadway is one of those areas where we have seen a lot of variance requests over the years. And so those areas point to us as areas that we want to take a close look at. So it may be that the current regulation is out of sync with what the community wants to see, or it's out of sync with the market. So those are areas, Broadway is a great example of when you're looking at the zoning map, what are those areas that kind of jump out that need some special attention? So,
and I think we have to get away from this notion that we have areas that are exclusively residential and areas that are exclusively commercial and areas that are exclusively recreational. The more we can mix those uses in a sensible way, I think the better city we're going to have, more vibrant.
Are there any provisions in here, in addition to the transit-oriented development, that really encourage mixed use, like Scott was talking about?
Yeah, actually, the city has grown and developed as a mixed-use city. So the areas that we all think are unique and special.
Despite the zoning ordinance in some cases.
Despite the zoning ordinance. But the things that are unique and special about Providence are because you can walk to places, because there is a mixed use, and that's what makes a city vital and vibrant. So we want to encourage that, and one of the ways we're going to do that is looking at the reuse of existing buildings and loosening up restrictions on that, and like I said, going back to the TOD district. So we already have a foundation of a mixed-use city, and we want to encourage that to flourish even more than it is.
We only have about a minute left, so this might be our last conversation, but I want to ask about height quickly. That's always a discussion in Washington, I know. Well, Scott, first to you, do you think
I've struggled with height my whole life.
Well put. They can't tell on your chair.
Right.
Should the city be allowing taller buildings in more of the city, just as a general rule? What do you think on that?
I think as a general rule, yes, but not everywhere. We don't want to Manhattanize Providence, but I do think that there is an advantage to having taller buildings, both for commercial and residential use in certain areas. It gives more people an opportunity to be close to the activities that they want to access, for example.
And Bonnie, 30 seconds, what do you think on the height issue? Do you think that'll be a part of this?
It will. I think, as we know, most of the tall buildings are going to be concentrated in the downtown area, which we're not really focused on in the next year. But in those areas, in the blue and red areas on that map, where we think we can accommodate some greater development and greater density, we might want to loosen up the restrictions on height in certain areas to allow for maybe 4- or 5-story buildings instead of 3 stories. And I think that can go a long way in creating this sort of vital and vibrant city.
All right, there's much more to talk about with this, and I know we'll be hearing a lot about it in PBN and elsewhere, but all the time we have this week on the show, I want to thank Bonnie Nickerson and Scott Wolf for joining me, and I especially want to thank Patrick Anderson, Providence Business News staff writer. You can follow him on Twitter along with me at AndersonPBN. If you missed any of the show or you want to catch up on previous episodes, you can get all those on our newly redesigned website, WPRI.com, and don't forget to read the Saturday Morning Post every Saturday morning on Nisi's Notes. And we'll see you next week here on Executive Suite.